Welcome back to Sunrise Daily. Well, yes, as you see there, Professor Utomi joins us now. He is the convener of the Big Tent, among several other designations. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. I'm glad to be able to join you.
Let's start on a light note. I mean, you've been in government circles a long time. You've been monitoring developments. You've gone from almost in several professions, really, media, economy, politics, in and around. But could you start by telling us, I mean, while you served as SA to former President Chagari at the time, what was it like? I mean, you were in your 30s at the time.
20s, actually.
20s. What was the environment like at the time?
Environment was different. In spite of all the things we said about that era, Nigeria was a country that was more inclusive, more merit-driven, more challenge. Let's even take how I got into government. Today, very sadly, most people who have a position in government have had deals. They've just bribed somebody 30,000 for their name to get into a conversation and all kinds of silly things that happen. Then you're told if you get that position, X% of your budget will come to me as a man who opened the door. I was just a kid, 26-year-old PhD who returned to the country, who had ideas about how to transform the country. And the leaders were watching, reading, and they said, how can we find that guy? And one day I showed up and they said, look, this thing you're talking about, tax policy, what can we do about it? And I went off, blah, 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 blah. And the next week they called me and said, can you replace this man who was my professor? That's the kind of country that I came back into as a young person. The putrid level of corruption today, the narcissism, the self-love that consumes people not thinking about the common good is so painful to watch. And if you see, you can't call it, it's not theory anymore because you can see its consequence in the slide of our country. I don't think any Nigerian who is reasonable can say their life is better today than it was 80 years ago. None.
So while you were there, were you able to directly influence policies?
Well, clearly, you know, if you are in that kind of position, especially back in those days, people considered ideas, thought was very critical. I'm not sure that it matters that much today. This is why we need to bring the momentum of what's going wrong in our country to a halt and literally begin again. I think that we make light. I mean, just watch the clip of the budget being passed and all of that. If you just looked at that document and you really know anything, you'll feel sick. Because what Nigeria desperately, desperately needs today is to provide opportunities, growth, employment to its teeming young people. And there are possibilities of extracting the demographic dividend from youth bulge in our country. Does our budget look like anything trying to achieve that? What's going on is that people have pet projects that they can extract rent from the system from, they've pushed in, and you've got this bloated thing. And I can feel very pained and very sorry for how our country has evolved. Thankfully, it's possible to change these things, to stop that momentum. You know, I like to think of examples, and you can even go to corporate world. There was a time when IBM ruled the world. It was the biggest corporation in the world. The big man who built IBM said, this is the way we do it, and corporate planning took it down, and all of that. And IBM began to lose grip and began to. In the end, the board realized the problem is us. We've got to get new thinking, and we've got to find people who have not been part of this mess. In the famous Einstein dictum, you know, the level of thinking that got us here is not the one that will solve the problem. So you need some kind of outside thinking. And they broke every rule. They went to RBG and Nabisco and hired a man who knew nothing about computers. And of course, everybody must have read the book that Louis Gessner Jr. wrote after he turned IBM around, who says elephants can't dance. We got to teach this elephant called Nigeria how to dance again, because it is possible. But we can't teach it how to dance with the people who created this mess, because they don't even understand that Nigeria is in a mess. Somehow the way that they see the prisms are such that they don't know what is really happening to their country.
You know, when you talk about you know, you have also been a part of the system.
Sure.
You see that there's a group of people who, you know, whom you're referring to. But generally, it would seem that at every point in time, so from the time of Shehu Shagari, we had a president, former president, or military head of state, IBB. Also, we had Buhari before the IBB. Then we had, after him, Abacha, a brief period, Shoneko, and then Abdul Salami, Abubakar, and then we now had Obasanjo. These people have been in the system, each person doing what they think that they can do to improve the system, at least at the time when they're there. We see efforts, but somehow it would seem that there are some fundamentals which have made it impossible for us to be able, despite best efforts of the people, or maybe if you don't think that they're good enough, or the efforts are good enough, in spite of their efforts, you know, it hasn't changed, for instance, our rentier economy, our extractive economy, from what it used to be. And some people say, oh, this actually has to do with how Nigeria itself was created.
It's not quite true. You know, what's the most important things that leaders do? Most important things that leaders do is set the tone of culture. I'll give you a small example. When General Buhari was elected in 2015, Abuja froze. People stopped all those funny practices for a while because they were scared of the consequence of behaving that way. They just watched, and after a few months, they saw same guys doing same things, and everybody went back with greater, you know,
gusto,
you know. So Nigeria can change, and leadership sets the tone of culture. I've watched this happen in several iterations. As an example I like to give, which includes even matters of budget and all of that. You talked about how I've been around for a long time. Indeed, this year is 50 years since I became an activist as a student at the University of Nigeria. We tried to overthrow the Student Union, created the Student Democratic Society, and so 50 years of doing this, and I can tell you where the problems are. General Obasanjo, I have fought for 50 years as a student, but I have a lot of respect for him, because you can see leadership in what he does at many points in Nigeria's history. When he was head of state back in the 70s, oil prices took a dip. He realized something had to be done, and he set the tone by saying, me, head of state, 504, Porsche 504, the official car for the head of state. And everybody goes down from there. Just that sensitivity is the power of leadership and culture. We've watched our country in the last couple of years drop into some incredible things like poverty capital of the world, and we know the statistics is death at childbirth and all of those things. On every Millennium Development Goal that makes sense, Nigeria is almost at the bottom. And you watch the swagger, what you guys call it, swag, of those in power, and you wonder, are they sane? People should respond to those things with certain ways of seeing problems and how they should be solved. But we carry on. I mean, there was a time that a president of Nigeria said, wait a minute, you know, you can measure the growth of our country by the fact that we're becoming the fastest growing private jets market in Nigeria. Whew. I was so incensed I called the villa. That was the only time I called the villa during that particular administration. Please beg him not to say that again. Because a country that was creating less and less wealth was having more and more people own private jets. If somebody doesn't see the fundamental problem in that. I have no problem in private jets. You can own 10 if you want. If you create the wealth, we'll see the jobs that are created out of that process of wealth creation. And if what amuses you is private jets, have them as a toy. But Nigeria was not creating wealth. It was not growing. It's young people increasingly unemployed. And what do we see? What we see is a disconnect between the state and society. The people who don't seem to understand that their primary responsibility as people in public authority is the common good of all. And that narcissism needs to be broken for us to reinvent Nigeria. That's where we are.
If I could just come in, Prof, I mean, you know, we looking through, just as Michael highlighted, different governments have come, administrations have gone. And for the most part, lots of people who worked and served with them, or even if you go down to the states, the governors, they all come from society into government. And today, that is how it will always be. But even sometimes you just wonder, so why is it that we haven't been able to have, you know, some sort of impact from people who have come from society into governance? And it appears as though even if they had lofty ideas while out there, once they get into government, things change.
Yeah. And this is because people have not had the courage of moral conviction. And me, public officials, like you say, have been around for like a bad coin forever. They come to me. I get on a flight, and a senator comes to me and says, you know, Prof, what we do in that place, I didn't want to be like that. I got there. I was literally threatened by colleagues and this and this and this and that. I smile. I say a few polite things, and I say to them, but you know, small number of you who think the right things should be done can get together and begin to make a difference, take a stand. The problem is we are increasingly numb to what is right because of some fundamental errors. One of those fundamental errors was 1999, and I'm part of the blame. What happened in 1999, 98, 99? I mean, we did the fighting to get the military out. I mean, we nearly took the bullet for it, but that's another matter. Military decides it's going. And we had to get together a group that I was part of founding called the Concerned Professionals. So what do? There were two views. Get into politics, all these things we've been writing every day that Abacha wanted to kill us for and all of that. Let's just go and implement that. Some said, we're citizens. That's our citizen duty. Let's allow politicians to now come, hoping they've learned lessons from the errors that brought the military. And we'll have a country that can thrive. Others said, well, you know, let's just go in there and get it done, whatever. In the end, those who said we're just citizens playing our duty won. And I'd like to say that I take the blame for siding with those who said, because I chaired the meeting. The politicians didn't come out. The real politicians, only few of them came out. Okay, so what happened? Because they didn't trust the military, they weren't sure they were going. Those dedicated politicians of the 60s who, made mistakes of overzealousness, but really were driven by the people's, desires. And that's why you can see the kind of progress that they made back in those days. Those people sat back to watch, and all kinds of scoundrels entered the arena. The bagmen of military entered the arena. Then history was unfair to us. Oil prices went to 3 digits, past $100 a barrel. And these guys privatized the state and used those resources to set a barrier of entry into politics. So money began to define politics. When money began to define politics, we couldn't get good men, really good men, to go in. And our country has been in serious trouble since then. That fundamental error has cost us a generation. It has to be reversed. It may take a revolution, and this revolution may either be violent or through the ballot box, but it's inevitable. No country can continue like this. if you check my writings 25 years ago, 20 years ago, there's nothing that's happening today in Nigeria that I didn't have in pen and paper. It's not, oh, you can read everything I projected what happened is happening today. These are unsavory things. And not because I'm smart, because I follow the trends of people who could easily, if you will, project these things. The people who've done this through history. It was easy to predict that we'll be where we are today in 2000, for example. Let me just take an example of violence that's everywhere. Robert Kaplan, an American, from far away there, projected the kind of ethnic cleavages that were building up, kind of economic cleavages that were building up, kinds of religious cleavages that were building up. Projected we could descend into anarchy. And actually was bold enough to suggest that this descent, or the convergence of these cleavages, come neatly, in a manner of speaking, together in a place in Nigeria called Jos.
Oh dear.
And if you track what has happened, began with those Jos riots. What was my personal reaction to reading Kaplan 20-something years ago? It was to say, look, society must be proactive to stop these things. First, I bought lots of copies of his book and sent to people I knew who were in policy-making roles. And they admit today that I did do that.
Did they read it?
Well, to be fair, a friend of mine who was DG of the SSS did read it. In fact, one morning, I was out of the country and he calls me. He says, Patu, where is that your friend Kaplan? I said, which my friend Kaplan? He said, I just finished reading the book. My phone rings. Jos is on fire. That was the beginning of our journey here.
Let's take the economy, for instance. It's clearly key, very important. But the budget, incidentally, is an abstract to a lot of people out there. But yet it is a very important document. Now, for those out there, I mean, people who may see it as an abstract, who think it doesn't have anything to do with their business, what is it you think that they should actually focus on and pay attention and probably should influence their decision if they go out there on February 25 and on March when they go out there to vote?
What do they consider the biggest challenge they have as a country? Significantly today is an economic challenge. And that economic challenge has created a social challenge in terms of violence. People who have nothing to lose are easy to be recruited as cannon fodder for people who have all kinds of causes that they are pursuing. We need to massively create jobs in this economy. I mean, when I meet people who have been out of university 10 years and have never had a job, I know there is a brewing crisis. Not a brewing crisis, it's waiting to explode. You need bold and imaginative thinking that can put these people to work and that can give people hope for the future. Right now, most Nigerians think there's no hope. And their first reaction is to want to leave. I went to New York for a conference and I took the train into Central New York from JFK. And it was a big mistake. I should have just suffered through the traffic because when I got out and I had to walk down to 38th Street Station, that long subway area, I ended up in 3 national conferences. Because as I run into one group of Nigerians and then they stop me. And then we have a national conference. So in one particular case, a couple she said, look, I was born here in New York because my father did Andrew. And then when things got better, my family returned to Nigeria. I went to primary school in Nigeria, I went to high school, I got married, and we're back here. And then you ask, if people are leaving, is it because they don't have the capacity to do things well? But here's pushback. 70% of doctors of color in the United States today are Nigerian. You meet a black doctor in America, 70% chance. He's Nigerian or she is Nigerian. Now, these Nigerians who are to leave Nigeria are now considered perhaps the single most prosperous nationality group living in North America, Canada and the United States. So we lose our best talents because we have a system that lacks merit. It doesn't take the best. And it's not just that we lose those talents. Those people who are not competent, who have taken over the system, just compound things because 80% of decisions they make are made in ignorance. And a good part of decisions are made in self-interest rather than understanding the common good. Eventually, it flows back to harm them even more. So, having a broad philosophy of how human history is shaped and what makes for human progress is critical to the kind of politics we must have. And there seems to be a loss of this. People seem to think of politics as some transactional thing. You know, you help me carry ballot box, I appoint you this, and that kind of thing. But it's much more than that. It has degraded our country. And somehow we need a new generation socialized differently to understand that politics is not just a game where you go to get something. Now, politics is where you go to seek immortality. You know, where you've built capacity, or you go there so that you'll be remembered forever for certain things that you do. Many of the fellows who are in the arena right now don't understand these things. And you can't blame them. They don't know. They're not wicked. They just don't know. Ignorance. They say it's not an excuse, but well, yeah, it's real.
Well, I do not know. I'm looking at the contenders right now on the scene. Looking at I know we're talking about how the economy is key, but I'm looking at the contenders on the scene. I'm looking at Rabiu Musa Kwankwanso, who's been there for a while. I'm looking at the candidate that the Big Tent has adopted, the candidate of the Labour Party. He's also been around for a while. He was governor of Anambra State as well, and also vice presidential candidate to the PDP presidential candidate. PDP presidential candidate too has been contesting for a while, and he was vice president of this country from 1999 to 2007. Also looking at Bola Tinubu, candidate of the APC, who's been governor of Lagos State. And all of these people, they all have something that they all say that they're bringing to the table. Why have you settled for the candidate of the Labour Party?
First, let me say that it's a pity that all we are looking at is the presidency. I'll come back to that. The biggest problem we have in Nigeria are the governors, because they don't understand their role. They don't have the, well, let's say they don't have what it takes to run, most of them run a country. They're just transaction players.
Well, some people will say the reason why we've done that is because you talk about the culture. I mean, you talk about how Abuja froze, for instance.
No, I'm coming to the presidency and why it's important. But I'm trying to say that we should probably broaden the conversation in that regard. Mm-hmm. Look, Nigeria grew the way it grew at independence because of the subnationals. Subnationals were at the heart of the growth of this country. And I can give you a couple of examples. And it is unfortunately because some excess happened in the way that they competed that we then got the military coming. But if you look at the heart of what they did, let's take industry. We're talking about industry now. How did they go into industrialization? Okay, Premier of the West decides, look, I'm going to go out and build an industrial park or estate or whatever they called it back then and get investors to come in. That's how the Ikeja industrial estate came. The East responded very, no, these people cannot do us. They went Transamadi in Port Harcourt and Aba. In fact, the East enticed away some companies like Pfizer who had moved into Ikeja to relocate to Aba. Then the North, Kakuri, in Kaduna. Some thinking that is dominant in the way I think we must change industrialization in Nigeria, so-called idea of latent comparative advantage. The Southern realized that the factor endowment in which the North was very strong was cotton, production of cotton. Invited these Hong Kong Chinese. Look, we talk about export-led industrialization as something we should aim for. They started it in 1960. first factory in Kaduna in 1960 began by exporting to Britain. First 6 months production was all sold out in Manchester. Before they started business, in 1 month they broke even. So all of those brought a certain clear progress to Nigeria, and they were subnational led. How many subnationals are doing those kinds of things today?
All right. Well, we need to go to break. But we'll return and continue this conversation. Don't go away. Welcome back to Sunrise. Today we are with Professor Pat Utomi, convener of the Big Tent. You were making a point as to why you settled for the candidate you settled for.
Right. So, having made the point about subnationals and the problems that we have in Nigeria, does the presidency matter? Absolutely. Because the tone is set very strongly from the top. How can we move from transactions to a transformational kind of leadership? In looking at the candidates, it was pretty clear to me that as political parties, some had reached irredeemable points unless major restructuring of those as political parties took place. How do you become candidate of the PDP or the APC? And you're talking to somebody who's been in all of them, or understands all of them, and has played from their founding. I was there at the founding of the PDP. I was there at the founding of the APC. My critical position was always there, but I was there at the founding. These parties, in the way they are structured, are so transactions-driven that to emerge in the process, you've already sold the country up. Committed to oil wells to this guy. You've committed to that ministry to this guy, and he is asking that X percentage of the budget of that ministry will come to him. And I'm not talking about stuff in the air, stuff I've dealt with, I've seen every day, I've spoken out personally one-on-one to all of them about. Okay? And so, fundamentally, I came to a conclusion years ago that neither the PDP nor the APC can bring out a candidate that can change Nigeria dramatically for good the way it was going. That's how the whole concept of third force, as some people like to call it, came up. We need to. How did the APC get founded? I give a lecture here in Abuja, Leadership Newspapers, annual lecture, I think it was 2012. And the title was Political Parties. I went to the very base of thinking around this 1911 book by a guy who, Roberto Michels, who looked at political parties and the challenges with them. And I made the point about the so-called iron law of oligarchy and how he who says organization says oligarchy. How are we going to free thinking such that we can get a new order? I remember when I finished the lecture here at the Sheraton, Ladikwali Hall, I believe it was, Dr. Paul Unongo ran up to me and said, I wish, and almost all the leaders of the opposition were present at that, were sitting on the high table. And they ran up to me and said, I wish I could lock this door. You people should not leave this place until they do what you are talking about. I said, well, I hope it happens. The process, in one way or the other, resulted in what became the APC. But I could tell you, just within weeks of the election, that we got it wrong. It was state capture, get-go. And I began to think, something different has to happen to save Nigeria. So, the reason that I would not touch a candidate of the PDP or the APC is that I know that they will not take Nigeria forward. They will get into these transactions, their friends will get rich, but Nigeria will still be stuck. So we needed a new kind of platform. So that's the first thing that recommended the new order. P2B came along into it fortuitously because there's some personal strengths that it brings to that rebuilding thing. Even though he's played in the system, if you look at his Anambra experience, let's not forget that P2B, amongst the things that he's done, is rebuild democracy. Anambra, they used to lock up their governors in the toilet and stuff. And what do they call these goons that own estates?
Godfathers.
Godfathers, just cutted away schools were closed, everything was shut for literally years. I mean, 2 years they didn't go to school or something. No pension benefits were being paid, no. Then he comes through that process. Anambra becomes a new kind of place. And democracy begins to thrive. Every pension was paid, all this. So, from what I know of him, he has the transformation mindset. And look at that, something me made about he's stingy. My goodness, the only thing you need now is a stingy man to run Nigeria. The guys are bleeding the place. You need the guy to stop this nonsense. Stop the bleeding.
That's really my colleagues in Lagos. Prof, I'm delighted that you went down memory lane speaking about how some things happened earlier on in our life as a nation. So permit me to take you to one of those issues that you raised, which is concerning corruption. Now, those who would argue that as far as corruption is concerned, it dates back well into pre-independence in Nigeria. There are those who
Sure.
point to the fact that, you know, one of the reasons for which the First Republic ended was because of corruption. I remember reading an article ascribed to Chief Obafemi Awolowo, late Obafemi Awolowo, that the politicians of the day they preferred imported products as opposed to things that were made in Nigeria. The same thing for the Second Republic. The national chairman of the ruling party at the time was so rich, so to speak, that he had a bottle of champagne, you know, made in his name. Definitely wasn't just one, I would imagine. Same for the Third Republic, perhaps. And not many people will say we've always been on the precipice as far as corruption is concerned, and our economy is always in jeopardy as a result. There are those who would then point to the fact that these are structural issues that have persisted until now, even while you were in government, as you said. So what is going to be different? What has to be different this time around? Because the structures seem to be there still.
If you look at all of human history, the thing that has prevented untoward things from happening are institutions. You have strong institutions, you have boundaries, and people behave within those boundaries, not because they are good people, but because there are consequences for behaving outside of the boundaries that are accepted. I mean, almost all intelligent writings on how the West grew rich go back to the place of institutions. You want to go to Neil Ferguson's grand tour in the book Civilization, or you want to go to more of the institutional economics school kinds of people's writings. Institutions are critical. And so institutional transition from colonial times with the Kabiyesi syndrome made it more difficult to get these boundaries in place quickly enough. And that led to some corruption. But it was still a much more, if you will, dignified territory. You found, for example, and I like to give one example because the person who tells this story, I have to give him the credit for, is Dr. Dakpo Fafura, was ambassador, senior civil servant from the 60s and 70s. Fafura tells the story about how a minister, a certain very powerful minister in the Balewa government, was traveling to his hometown in Abeokuta, and the car broke down and he had to go to a mechanic. And they fixed the car, he got a receipt that he paid for fixing the car, the official car. Came back, submits a receipt to get a refund. The permanent secretary looks at the receipt. It turns out the date was a Saturday, and he queried the minister's use for an official car on a Saturday. And the prime minister was bound to remove the minister for that error. But the prime minister was very close to this very powerful minister and had to plead with the PAMSEC, say, look, please, 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 this will be such a blow to my government if my close ally is... So he had to be punished anyway, and so he was demoted to a smaller ministry. That was. You just imagine that's happening today. So back in those days, yes, there always was some corruption, but not the kind of wholesale corruption that you have today, accepted almost as it were by the civil service, by everybody. And so it gets worse. So yes, there was corruption back then, and there were institutional checks. Had our institutions continued to evolve, and if you understand institutions, you'll find that one of the best writings on institutions and their impact on performance was that of Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize for his work there. And the point that North makes is that institutions evolve. They are a function of all our getting together as civil society, as I say, no, this is not acceptable, this is... And then
Prof,
eventually becomes a settled habit of the community.
well,
So institutions could have checked the corruption that was there in the system if we continue to strengthen our institutions.
but perhaps that's where the
But
problem
what has happened
is.
is that with military rule, it got worse. Yeah.
Perhaps, Prof, that's where the problem is actually, because there was some corruption and it was not decisively dealt with. And there is a known fact: what you sow, you will reap, if you do not remove the seed on time. And perhaps that's one can also say that that's the progression then. It will be remiss of us to not talk about the economy at all with you this day. But successive budgets over the years always sought to resolve economic challenges. But then that virus of corruption seems to always eat away at the heart of whatever intention the budgets usually have. This budget, 2023 budget also, for instance. What's your take on that?
Well, I have said for many years that I don't discuss budgets for a simple fact that I don't think that the institutional arrangement in Nigeria takes budgeting seriously. I have actually described the budget process in Nigeria as a joke. Why did I do that? Back when I first came back around 1982, after every budget, the analysts, and I used to be invited to analyze budgets back in those days, would say, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, blah, 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 blah. Then in December, they would say, oh, poor implementation. And I would say, nonsense. What do you mean poor implementation? A plan, a policy that does not look at the problems of implementation was ab initio a bad policy. So don't blame implementation. Nigerians say, oh, the problem is implementation. Is not true. Because you see, many times when budgets are being made in this country, people know that those who have authority don't follow the budget anyway. You have a state governor or government, and they put out a budget for the year. Nobody talked about painting the governor's lodge. And a friend comes to governor and says, my friend, why is this governor's lodge yellow? You are promoting MTN. He said, hey, really? Paint the thing green. Say, there's nowhere in the budget where they say paint budget, but they're painting the thing green. And the friend says, you're not promoting that other telco. Hey, paint it red. So I decided more than 20-something years ago that I was not going to discuss budgets. And I said so to one of your colleagues, Shehu, when they tried to drag me into a budget discussion. So we need to rebuild the civil service. I mean, we can't get anywhere in all we're talking about if we don't deconstruct and rebuild the civil service. It is not what it was
Prof,
when the Philip Asiodos were permanent secretaries.
Yes, indeed. Good morning, Prof. In rebuilding the civil service, we may need to also yet again explore the leadership challenge, which is why I want to take you back to some part of your commentary. I noted that you talked about 2015 when the current president was elected. Abuja practically froze, and there was some form of institutional behavioral change, however momentary it was. And afterwards, not long afterwards, it was business as usual yet again. What exactly happened at that point? Don't you think that it flows from the top. What did the top, or in other words, the current president didn't follow up with that should have sustained that behavioral change?
The people he appointed were known corrupt people, very well-known corrupt people. And some people say, what's he talking about? And that's it. That was the end.
So what's going to be different if the candidate that you have endorsed is elected? Wouldn't it be business as usual when he settles into office and, you know, things just go back to where they were from the beginning?
I would definitely hope not. I would be the first to call him out, which has always been my style. We must realize that what is at stake is so big, the future of our children, almost so mortgaged already. We must realize that we have come to a point where something fundamental, a discontinuous push, if you will, has to happen for us to save our country. And this is why Peter Obi, our presidency, has a lot that it owes to the future. And if he does not, if he starts by appointing some of these funny characters, well, he will hear from me, I can assure you that, you know.
You know, I know that oftentimes most leaders want to write. But then you look at the consequences. Let's take a look at fuel subsidy, for instance. The Buhari administration, before it came into office, in fact, the president said that he doesn't believe that there's anything called fuel subsidy. And people have just automatically assumed that it was going to go. We've seen the flip-flops in terms of fuel subsidy, but almost every single party now is saying fuel subsidy is something that we're going to take away. The candidate of the Labour Party has said it's organized crime. That of the APC says it's going to take it away. I'm not very certain if that of the PDP is saying that yet, as clearly as, you know, other parties are saying it. But I'm wondering what the implications of that will be, because already we're seeing that the price, you know, they are forcing it to stay at a certain price. And when that eventually happens, what do you think the immediate implication will be?
Well, first of all, nothing happens in vacuum, in space. Everything is within context. There are countries that have subsidies to drive certain goals. If you just have subsidy just to have subsidy, you just create opportunity for abusers to thrive. Look, there's a friend of mine who owns an oil marketing company. He's considered a very rich person. And one day he was in my home with several people, and I said to him, you know that your business is really a fraud. He looked up at me, I looked at people, and I said, you know why it's a fraud? Everywhere in the world, petrol is the ultimate commodity. It is so commodity, the margins are so thin that you really can't make money selling petrol. You have to take advantage of the fact that it's an essential commodity, everybody needs it. And so they drive into your forecourt to buy petrol. Then you see, what can I sell them I can make money off of? This is why you will see Minimart from Mobil, you will see Bonjour from Total. That's where they make their money, not from the sale of petrol, because it's the ultimate commodity. But in Nigeria, once you own a petrol marketing company, rich man, it's a farce, it's a fraud. So I think we have to come to some fundamental understandings of economics. The dirigist mindset of state control is used to create rent champions. And one of the areas is easiest to create a rent champion is with this business of petrol, its processing, its distribution, and all of that. A friend of mine used to be managing director of the Warri refinery when it worked back in those days. In fact, the poor man jackpot a long time ago, you know, because he just couldn't take it anymore in Nigeria. He said, look, and because politicians have managed to make it, whether they're soldiers or civilians, people, there's no petrol, there are queues. So people who worked in NNPC, Warri refinery back in those days, would, on Friday evening, suddenly create a crisis. One part has broken, the part has broken. and the guy knows the consequence. He could be removed the next day. Okay, what will it cost? I need to fly to London tonight to go and bring the pattern. Friday evening, he approves $200,000, whatever. The guy goes to his garage where the thing is sitting and brings it down. He knew that was going on. So it has been organized crime for a long time, the whole petrol business.
What I'm saying is, what do you think the implications
That's what I was coming to. The mindset is that dirigist mindset that allows it. If you say petrol, everybody who can import and sell petrol with certain standards, please go out and import and sell petrol. The price will come to what it should be. That's the market concept. We don't have a market, and that's why people are playing these games. If we had a market, look, in some cities where I've spent time in the United States of America, there are people who travel right across town to the other side to go and buy petrol. Because they're selling petrol in their side of town, 4 or 5 cents per gallon or whatever it is, a liter, more than across town. And they will drive right across a huge city to go and buy petrol. Markets work. When you push markets out, they're just trying to find opportunities to scam people, make some people rich. And in that way, you impoverish others.
A fine place to anchor. Professor Utomi, convener of the Big Tent. Thank you very much for coming on, and all the best, sir.
Thank you for having me.